and welcome to my first ever print and paint video, where I'm going to show you how I turn this into this. So if you want to see the whole process, make sure you stick around to the very end. So the model we're going to paint today is one of the Midgard Vikings from Asgard Rising miniatures. Now this guy comes with a couple of options. You can give him either the sword or the axe. It is a pretty nice model, so if you want to check it out for yourself, I will leave a link in the description. Right, so these are the files you get, and as you can see there's quite a few options there for you depending on how you want to print the model. But today we are going to use this pre-supported option just to keep things nice and easy. So as you can see, everything there, all the options, and I think one of the best things is that if you take a closer look, the supports are on skate supports, which not all pre-supported models come with. So let's slice it so you can look at the details. Right, so here is the printed model, all cleaned, cured and stuck together, and as you can see it came out pretty nicely. Overall, to be honest, I am more than happy with how the print came out, and dare I say this came out much better than I could have hoped, really. The amount of detail on here is pretty insane. If we zoom in on the shield, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, it's pretty damn good. It also goes onto the helmet, which unfortunately the camera doesn't quite pick up here, but you will see that a bit better later on. Yeah, overall really happy. The supports for the pre-supports worked well. One little hiccup on the beard. One of the supports, the side of it does make contact with the beard, but it's quite easily removed, and I think I clean up a bit more after I film this. But yeah, overall more than happy. I've opted with the sword this time round, but I may paint another one later with the axe. Right, so before we go on to painting, I just wanted to quickly mention something about the Monocore 3D black pigment that you saw me mix into my resin earlier on. I just wanted to do a quick comparison between this and a model using regular resin straight from the bottle. So the model on the left is one that I've printed before. I've used the same resin for both of these, which is the water washable stuff from Elegoo. But I just wanted to show you a quick comparison of the difference it makes just by adding some of that black pigment to the resin. And I was basically hoping that it would help make the detail stand out more, especially on camera, so everyone can see you know, much more detail and just see things a lot clearer. And yeah, I think it did a pretty good job. In hindsight, I think I would add maybe one or two more drops to make it a little bit darker, but overall I'm pretty happy with how that came out. Right, so to start off with, we are going to use some black primer from Vallejo, and I'm just going to apply this all over the model using my airbrush. Now unfortunately the camera did decide to focus on my thumb and the airbrush a little bit here, but yeah, just a basic all over primer of the black here. And after that we are switching to white primer, and we're going to apply a little xenophobe highlight from the top down, again using the airbrush. I'm not going to go all out with the xenophobe here. The main focus is just to get a nice sort of top down highlight, and also just get a nice kind of like, you know, highlight on the skin, so I can see, you know, where the real kind of light's going to hit, where the shade needs to be for when we come to paint the skin later on. Right, so the white came out a little bit pebbly. I probably could have done with thinning that down a little bit more, but to be honest, as I said, I wasn't going for a, you know, proper zenithal job. I just really wanted to get that initial highlight on there. So for the skin, we're going to start off with Kislev flesh. Again, we're going to apply this through the airbrush, and we're just going to do a few thin coats here just to build up the sort of initial start of that skin tone. Right, so with that Kislev flesh done, we are finished with the airbrush. So as you can see, we've got a nice smooth finish on here for all that flesh. To be honest with you, I only really use the airbrush for priming and initial base coats. But we are going to crack on with the skin now, and we're going to use a bit of Riken flesh shade, and we're going to mix that down a little bit with Lamia medium to create a nice sort of, you know, thin glaze to go all over the skin. I'm not going to use it as a wash or anything like that. I'm literally just going to apply a thin layer just to basically add a bit of warmth to the skin. So with that glaze done, you can see it's added a slightly warmer feel to the overall look of the skin. And as I said, I was careful not to let that pool anywhere in the recesses. But what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go back to that Riken flesh shade, and I'm going to use it straight from the pot and apply it directly to the recesses just to add a bit of definition. Kind of like a wash, but as I said, I'm applying this directly into the recesses, but I'm going to be careful to only use a small amount at a time because I don't want it to be too dark, because I want the overall sort of finish to the skin to actually be quite light. So with that shading done, you can see we've actually added a nice little bit of definition overall to the skin now. But what we're going to do next is take that a little bit further, and we're going to use some Darko Flesh contrast paint, and we're going to mix that down a little bit with some contrast medium just to make a glaze. And I'm going to use this in very small amounts to gradually build up a bit of shadow on the skin, if you like. This is basically going to be applied to the areas around the back of him and also under his arm, just where things would be, you know, perhaps a little bit darker. Essentially where the black primer was left after we did the initial xenophobe highlights. And this again will just add a bit more definition and help emphasize that a little bit more. Right, so that's basically all of the glazing and shading done, and what we're going to do next is we're actually going to go back in the opposite direction and we're going to start applying some highlights. So we're going to jump back to the Kislev flesh that we started off with. Again, we're going to use this as like a glaze, and we're just going to apply it to the top areas of the muscles and all the skin, just leaving everywhere that we've applied the shade. Right, so with that highlight done, you can see it's coming together quite nicely now, and we're actually nearly finished with the skin. What we are going to do next is we're just going to apply a final highlight, and to do that we're going to use some flayed one flesh, and this is just going to be applied again like a small glaze, just over the very tops and edges of some of the muscles. We don't want to go overboard with this. It's really going to be on the very sort of top areas. Just to emphasize, you know, basically almost like reflections, just where the light's hitting those parts of the muscles. And there we have it. That is pretty much the skin finished with those final highlights done. And what we're going to do next, just to finish everything off, we're going to use a little bit of Carabao Crimson, again mixed down with some medium to create a bit of a glaze. And all I'm going to do with this is just apply a little bit around the mouth, just add a bit of colour to the lips there, and also just around the fingertips, because actually sculpted on here is some nails, so we're just going to go around the edges of those, because that will look better than actually painting the nails. Okay, so that's that done, and we are completely finished with all of the skin. So we're going to go on to the rest of the model now, and I'm going to jump to Snakebite Leather. This is another contrast paint, and this is just going to be applied to the boots and his trousers, and also to the van braces on his forearms. With that snakebite leather dry, you can see it actually worked quite nicely with the xenophobe highlights that we did at the start. So I was pretty happy with how that came out. Next up, we're going to paint the rest of the leather, and we're going to use Rhinox hide as the base, and once that's dry we're going to apply some Doomball brown. And this is just to mix up the leather a little bit, and I kind of like to use this this recipe that I'll show you for doing things like straps, belts, handles on swords and stuff like that. I think it's nice to mix things up so all the leather's not exactly the same. It's also going to be used around the kind of leather armour. There's kind of like a leather chainmail, I don't know the name for it, that also goes around his legs. So with all that leather painted up, we are done there for now. We will come back to that a little bit later on. But next up we're going to jump to Xandri dust, and we're going to use this on his beard, and we're also going to apply it on his horns as a base coat, and also on the inside of his shield there's actually a little bit of wood there, so we're going to use it as a base coat for that as well. So with that Xandri dust done, we have layered a nice little foundation for the next few steps. And what we're going to do next is we're actually going to use another couple of contrast paints. We're going to use Wildwood on that bit of wood showing on the inside of the shield, and we're actually going to use a bit of Skeleton Horde on the beard as well. Right, with those two done, we are going to move on to the fur and the horns. We're going to apply a bit of a Shabti bone all over the horns, and then we're going to use Wraith bone to apply a nice base coat to all of the fur that you see around the model. Right, the Wraith bone does look pretty bright. It did kind of trip out the camera a little bit, so it's not quite sure what's going on. But we're going to use some Agrax Earthshade next, and we're actually going to use this to add a wash to all of the areas we just did. So I'm actually going to apply this all over the fur, we're going to apply it all over the horns, and I'm actually going to apply a smooth amount over the beard. I'm not going to let it pull too much on the beard, but I just want to add a little bit more definition to it. With the Agrax done, you can see it has made a nice bit of difference to that fur. It's also added a little bit more definition to the beard and obviously to those horns. Next up we're going to jump to Iron Hand Steel, and this is going to be applied all over the back of the shield, the sword, the helmet, and also to the little bit of chainmail that he's got sort of on the front and the back of him as well. Right, so that's all the main parts of the armour done. Next up, what we're going to do is we're going to start painting the gold, and we're going to use some Retributor armour for that. And to finish it off, we are going to use a bit of lead belcher just to paint all the rivets that you find around the shield and on the helmet as well. Right, so everything's starting to come together quite nicely now. Most of the model has got some paint on it. You can see all that metal's done, all looking pretty good so far. I also painted on the hilt of the sword those two little red gems with some corn red. I don't know if they are gems, but I've decided they are. And what we're going to do next is we're going to take some Nuln Oil, some black wash, and I'm actually going to apply that to all of the metal areas that we've just painted. But also to all of those leather areas that I painted earlier on. And I'm going to use a very, very small controlled amount on the beard and also on the fur, just to emphasize a little bit more shading on those parts. Right, now that wash has dried, you can see what a difference it makes. That's usually one of my favourite parts, is getting the wash on, because it just makes all the detail pop and make things look like it's getting close to finishing. We're going to go back to the leather now, and we're going to go and use that Doomball Brown just to basically relayer all of the leather that we've washed, leaving just the shade in the recesses, and then we're going to highlight it with a bit of tusk or fur as well. Again, this is quite a thin layer that we're applying, so we don't want to ruin the shading. We want a nice smooth transition across the leather as well. Right, that is all the leather done. I did add a small amount of cadium flesh tone to some of the edges just for an extreme highlight, and I also added a few scratches on there. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to Xantry Dust, and we're going to use this to basically apply a little layer onto the beard just to bring back some of the lighter tones, basically for the blonde that we've kind of shaded out a little bit by using all those washes. Okay, beard done. I'm pretty happy with how that came out in the end. Next up, we're going to use some pallid witch flesh, and we're going to use a small amount of this in like a thin sort of glaze layer again, and we're going to use this on all of the fur just to add a nice little highlight to those areas. Again, just brightening it back up after we've applied those washes to it. Okay, so that's all the fur done. Next up, we're going to continue on with the highlights. This time we are going to use a Shabty Bone and Screaming Skull, and we're going to go back to those horns and just get those finished off. Right, horns are finished. Next up we are going to go back onto the metallic areas, and I'm going to use a bit of Oricama Gold and Iron Breaker for these. Oricama Gold I probably use quite differently to most people because I tend to use it like a glaze. I like to water it down quite a bit, and I actually just use it just to bring a bit of shine back to the gold as opposed to, you know, repainting those areas. So you'll see that I don't really have a lot on my brush when I do this part. With all the bling brought back to the metallic areas, the final step to finish all of those off is to add an edge highlight, and I'm going to use a bit of Stormhost Silver for this part. So I'm basically just going to go around all the edges of the gold, all of the silver, even the rivets that we painted earlier, just basically all of the metallic areas, and just do a little edge highlight on all of those. So that wraps up all of the metal. We're getting pretty close to finishing now. What I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to paint those two gems that you see on the hilt of the sword. There are two on the front and on the back. And to do that, I am going to use a combination of these four colours. We're going to use a bit of a Baden Black, some White Scar, Wazdaka Red, and Fire Dragon Bright. And I'm actually going to show you just very quickly the steps I use to paint these gems. First off, I take a bit of a Baden Black, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little patch of this to the very top right hand corners of these gems, and this is usually done where the uppermost part where the light will actually catch them. And then we take the mid-tone, the red, this is the Wazdaka Red, and we just put a little bit of a highlight on the very bottom corner on the opposite side to where we did the black. and once that red is done, we basically do the same with the orange, but this time a much smaller highlight, and this is just applied inside of the red one. And to finish it off, a little spot of white scar. This is done on the black, basically where the light is hitting the gem. And I also like to add a little dash, a little line underneath that spot, just to add a little sort of line of reflection as well. So with those two gems done, the finishing line is pretty much in sight. We're going to move on to the base next, and to do the base we're going to use some Skeleton Horde contrast paint again, and a little bit of Athonian camo shade. So I'm going to apply the Skeleton Horde basically all over the ground of the base, and then once that's dry we're going to add a few patches using the Athonian camo shade. Now the base is dry. It's also worth pointing out that I did apply some more snakebite leather to the front of the boots, and I did a little bit of highlighting with a Steel Legion drab just because I wasn't quite happy with how they looked earlier on. But we're going to move on to the rocks now. So we're going to use some Dawnstone as a base coat with some Agrak Surfshade Wash, and then we're going to highlight with a little bit of dry brushing using these three afterwards. Okay, rocks are finished. It's also worth pointing out that I repainted a bit of the detail on the sword as well. Basically the bit that goes up the base of the blade, I decided to that gold because I wasn't quite happy with it silver. It didn't look quite right. But next we are going to paint those two bits of wood on the base, and to keep things simple we're going to go back to the recipe that we used on the shield and just do a base coat of Xandri dust, and then when it's dry we're going to hit it with a bit of wildwood contrast paint. Okay, so we are almost finished. Scattered around the base are things that look like little seashells or something. I'm not quite sure what they are, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint most of them using some Corax White, followed by some more Skeleton Horde, and then just to add a little bit of variation I'm going to paint one or two of them with Xandri dust and a bit of Griffhound Orange. And then to finish off I'm going to paint the rim of the base using some trusty Abaddon Black. Right, so there we have it, one finished model. I'm pretty happy with the outcome. Pretty chuffed with how this turned out. There's a lot of sort of experiments in there, things I haven't done before, a lot of the contrast paints I'd never used before, and a few sort of like recipes that I'd literally just thought off the top of my head and tried. So yeah, pretty happy with how this turned out. Right, so that is that guy done. As I said before, there's a few experiments in there, a few new colour recipes that I've never used before, so I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And to be honest with you, that is the first thing I've painted for, I don't know, it's months. It's been a while, but I'm pretty happy with the outcome. I'm more than happy with the model itself, so I'm definitely going to check out some more of their stuff. And if you like this video and you want to see more of this kind of thing, please do let me know. And as usual, any kind of feedback, anything like that, please leave a comment and I will get back to you. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Until next time, thank you for watching and I will see you then.